we are going to continue the reading of Property and Capital from where we left off last time, which was somewhere in the middle of part 2. And the parts, really, when I say parts, I am talking about the different parts that were published in the separate Prometeo journals, right? The sections themselves refer to the numbered sections within the text. Meaning that, for example, in part 2 we have section 2 and 3. It doesn't restart from section 1 all over again. So this might be a little bit confusing, but it makes sense when you have a look at the text. Anyways, we start with section 3, the terms of the socialist demand. Before delving into the topic of this research, which concerns the legal institutions of property accompanying the capitalist economy in its historical course, it is however necessary to recall again what have always been the true terms of the great socialist demand. This consists historically, leaving aside the literary and philosophical hints of communism regarding goods that existed in pre-bourgeois regime ever since antiquity, and also related to the special reflections on class upheavals, in the movement that has invested from its inception the social underpinnings of the capitalist regime and system. A movement of critique and combat whose complete form is inseparable from the actual intervention in the social struggles of the wage-earning working class and from its organization into an international class party adhering to the doctrine of the Communist Manifesto and Marx. The socialist demand, enunciated millions of times in the pages of volumes of theory or in the modest words of speeches and agitational leaflets, cannot be alive and real unless the dialectical method of Marxism is applied, both in its simple immediacy and in its mighty depth. The cry of protest against the absurdities, injustices, inequalities, and infamies with which the bourgeois capitalist regime is materially endowed is not enough to build the proletarian socialist demand. And in this sense, the innumerable pseudo-socialist or semi-socialist postures of humanitarian philanthropists, utopians, libertarians, apostles, all of them more or less excited by new ethics and social mysticisms, were insufficient. The cry of the proletariat and Marxism to the bourgeois regime is not a vade retro satana. It is simultaneously a welcome, and in a given historical epoch an offer of alliance, as well as a declaration of war and a proclamation of distraction. An incomprehensible position to all those who base their explanation of history and its struggles on religious beliefs and moral systems, or more generally on non-scientific and even unconsciously metaphysical methods, seeking in every event and at every stage of the history of human thought the play of fixed criteria duly capitalized as good, evil, justice, violence, freedom, authority. Of all the features of social organization that capitalism had brought into being with its advent, some are acquisitions that proletarian socialism not only accepts but without which it could not exist. Others are forms and structures that it sets out to annihilate after their spread. Its demands must therefore be defined in relation to the various points in which we have arranged the typical elements, the distinctive features of capitalism at the time of its victory. This is a revolution, and it is a first general historical prerequisite for the advent of the regime for which socialists fight. The almost immediate taking of an anti-capitalist stance, no matter how radical and crude, does not have the character of a restoration, an apologia for pre-capitalist conditions and forms in general. It is necessary today to reassert all this clearly, even though it is more than a century since the repeated efforts of our school have driven to the same end, for at every step in the history of the class struggle dangerous deviations have given rise to movements and doctrines that falsify very important positions of revolutionary socialism. In the previous chapter, we first recalled the well-known technical organization characteristics of capitalist production as opposed to artisanal and feudal production. As a whole, these characteristics are preserved and integrally claimed by the socialist movement. The cooperation of numerous workers in the production of the same type of object, the successive division of labor, that is, the allocation of workers among the various and successive stages of the production process, culminating in the same finished product, and the introduction into productive technology of all the resources of applied science with engines and operational machinery are contributions from the capitalist epoch that we certainly do not propose to renounce, and which will indeed be the basis of the new socialist organization. A no less important and irrevocable gain is the release of technological processes from mystery, secrecy, and corporative exclusivity, a certain starting point in the determinist view of the difficult development of science from the ancient fetters of witchcraft, religion, and philosophy. The demonstration that the bourgeoisie has implemented these advances by overpowering the barbaric methods and by plunging the productive masses into misery and wage slavery remains always essential. But this is certainly not to propose a return to the free production of the self-employed artisan. The moment he, together with the small peasant, was stripped of all possessions and reduced to a wage laborer, his immiseration came about and his resistance was overcome by violence. But the new criteria for organizing the productive effort made it possible to enhance its outcome and performance in the social sense. In spite of the industrial master's levy on the general scale, the masses were enabled to satisfy new and more varied needs with the same labor time. Even before we consider the enormous advantages in productive output to which the division of labor and mechanization led, we consider a definite advantage and one from which we do not presume to exclude the simple economy of transportation, business operations and management which manufacturing leads to as compared with the mere workshops. Every craftsman was the bookkeeper, cashier, salesman, clerk for himself with enormous waste of labor time, and in a large factory one employee does the same service for every 100 workers. Any proposal for a new fragmentation of the productive forces concentrated by capital is reactionary for socialists, and we speak of productive forces not only in regard to the man engaged in the work we are now discussing, but also, of course, the masses of materials to be worked and processed, the tools of labor and all the complex modern faculties useful for mass and serial production. It should not be seen as a digression to note that the acceptance in the socialist demand of the progressive concentration of plants and workplaces as opposed to the small business economy does not at all mean acceptance of that consequence of the capitalist system which consists in accelerated technical industrialization of given areas while leaving others in retrograde conditions. And this is just as true when comparing country to country as it is when comparing city to city. This relationship historically subsists until the bourgeois regime has exhausted its phase of despoliation and the reduction of the old productive classes to property wage earners. Dialectically, the socialist position cannot fail to leverage the revolutionary leadership function of the workers whom capitalism has urbanized into large masses, but tends to spread modern technical resources into all territories together with a modern way of life richer in expression, as we have enunciated since point 9 of the immediate program in the manifesto, the gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country without contrast, with all the other measures of a clearly centralizing nature in the organizational sense. The same criterion guides the socialist positions on the relation between metropolises and colonies, the latter of which are to be relieved of their exploitation by the former, without forgetting that only capitalism in its developments could accelerate this result by centuries and centuries. Although in this field it has exceeded all limits in the use of ruthless methods of conquest. Having thus inherited the enormous development of the forces of production from the capitalist revolution, socialists set out to upset the corresponding apparatus of forms, relations of production, which is reflected in judicial institutions. And this after having accepted that proletarians, the fourth estate, fought in alliance with the bourgeoisie when it broke the forms and institutions of the previous regime to found and consolidate its own and to extend them into the advanced and backward world. But in what precise sense does our historical demand involve breaking down and overcoming these forms? The capitalist productive revolution has violently separated workers from their product, from their instruments of labor, from all the means of production in the sense that it has suppressed their right to dispose of them directly, individually. Socialism condemns this despoliation, but it certainly does not postulate giving back to every artificer his paraphernalia and the consumable object he fashioned with it, for him to go to the market and exchange it for his subsistence. In a sense, the separation brutally enacted by capitalism is historically final. But in our dialectical perspective, this separation will be superseded on a more distant and broader plane. The paraphernalia and end product used to be at the individual disposal of the free and autonomous artificer. They have now passed to the disposal of the capitalist master. They will have to return to the producer class. It will be a social agreement, not an individual or even a corporative one. It will no longer be a form of property but of general technical organization, and if we wanted to, as of now, to refine the formula by anticipating the process, we should speak of being at the disposal of society and not of a class, since such organization tends towards a form of society that is classless. However, without for now talking about the disposition and ownership by the individual over the object he is about to consume, we cannot include in the socialist demand the worker's personal discretion over the object he has manipulated. If the worker in a shoe factory under bourgeois rule takes away a shoe, he will not avoid jail time by proving that it matched his foot size well, and all the worse if he intended instead to sell it for, say, bread. Socialism will not consist in allowing the worker to live with a pair of shoes on his shoulder, but this is not to say because they were stolen from the master, but because it would contribute a ridiculously slow and cumbersome system of distributing shoes to everyone. And before we see in this a problem of law or morality, we see in it a materially technical problem, for which we need only to think of the workers in a railroad wheel factory, or to provide even more obvious examples that illustrate the revolutions to which the innovations of technology and life are leading. We need only to think of people who work in power plants or radio transmitter stations, and have no reason, just as in 100 other cases, to be searched on the way out. Now, the question of ownership over the complete or even semi-finished product is actually the crucial one, and it is much more important than ownership over the production tool, factory, workshop, or plant. The real characteristic of capitalism is the allocation of products and the consequent power to sell them on the market to a private master. In general, at the beginning of the bourgeois era, this attribution derives from that of the mill, factory, or plant to a private owner, the industrial capitalist, in a form treated legally like that which attributes ownership of agrarian land or of houses. But such individual property is a static, formal fact. It is the mask of the real relationship that interests us, which is dynamic and dialectical and consists in the characters of the productive movement, in the grafting of the incessant economic cycles. Thus, the socialist demand, while it had to accept the substitution of associated labor for individual labor, proposed to suppress the attribution in private property of the products of collective labor to a single owner, head of company, free to dispose of them at his pleasure. It logically expressed this postulate relative to the whole economic dynamic as abolition of the industrialist's free private right over the productive plant. However, this formulation is incomplete, even on a level to which we adhere in this paragraph, i.e., of the negative and destructive content of the socialist economic position, since it does not yet deal with the type of productive and distributive organization of the socialist regime, and the way to get there, in the field of economic measures and political struggle. The formulation is incomplete in that it does not say what is required to happen to the other forms peculiar to the capitalist economy, having made it clear that the intention is to suppress the attribution of all final products in a complex organization to a single master of both the former and the latter. In fact, the capitalist economy became possible because the separation of workers from the means and products found the mercantile distributive mechanism already in place, so that the capitalists could take the products to the market and create the wage system, giving the workers a share of the products so that they could obtain subsistence on that same market. The artisan approaches the market as both buyer and seller, whereas the wage laborer can approach the market only as a buyer, and with limited means owing to the law of capital gain. The socialist demand classically consists in abolishing the wage laborer. Only the abolition of the wage laborer leads to the abolition of capitalism. But being unable to abolish the wage laborer in the sense of restoring the absurdly backward figure of the worker as a seller of his product to the market, socialism, from its origins, calls for the abolition of the market economy. As we have already mentioned, the mercantile framework for the distribution of goods preceded capitalism and encompassed earlier economies of all sorts, going all the way back to the one in which there was a market for human persons, slavery. Modern mercantile economy means monetary economy. Thus, the anti-mercantile demand of socialism equally entails the abolition of money as a medium of exchange and as well as a means of practical formation of capital. Capitalism inevitably tends to resurrect in the economic environment of mercantile and money distribution. If this were not true, we could agree to tear up all the pages of Marx's Capital. The anti-mercantilist assertion lies in all the texts of Marxism and especially in Marx's polemics against Proudhon and all forms of petty bourgeois socialism. It is to the credit of the communist program, drafted, albeit in a very verbose text, by Bukharin, to have put this most vital point back into full relief. But at the end of the previous section, we set out a third distinctive point of capitalism compared with the regimes it vanquished: the deduction from the product of the worker's labor power of a large share that is destined for the boss's profits, and above all, the allocation of a major part of this share to the accumulation of a new capital. It is obvious that the socialist demand, if we wanted to take away from the bourgeois master the right to dispose of the product and take it to the market, would take away his right over the ownership of the factory and at the same time also the availability of capital gain and profit. More than a century ago, it proclaimed that the wage laborer could be abolished, and this meant overcoming the kind of market economy that existed hitherto. By destroying the market for goods where the small medieval craftsman timidly arrived with a few manufactured articles, and where the products of modern collaborative labor arrive with the capitalist character of commodities, it is no less clear that the market for capital goods and the capital market itself, and therefore the accumulation of capital, are also destroyed. But even all of this does not suffice. We've already said that in the process of accumulation there is a social side. We have recalled that in the sentimental propaganda, and which of us socialists did not abuse it, we used to put forward the inequity in the face of an abstract distributive justice, of the levy of capital gain going to the consumption of the capitalist or his family, to live on a far different standard of living than that of the workers. Abolition of profit, we cried out then, and it was most right as it was little. For 100 years, bourgeois economists have been presenting us with the account showing that all national income of a country divided by the number of its citizens gives one a living barely higher than the humble laborer. The account is accurate, but the refutation is as old as the socialist system, although one will never find a Pareto or Einaudi capable of understanding it. The various provisions that the capitalist makes before drawing his last profit, with which he amuses himself, are partly for rational and for social purposes. In a collective economy too, one will have to set aside products and tools in such portions as will preserve and advance general organization, in a sense that there will be social accumulation. Would we socialists then say that we want to substitute social accumulation for private personal accumulation? We still would not. If the capitalist's consumption of a share of capital gain is a private matter, which we call for to be abolished, but is nevertheless of little quantitative weight, even capitalist accumulation is already a social matter and a fact that tends to be useful to all on the social level. Old economies that only hoarded have stood still for whole millennia, whereas the capitalist economy that accumulates has, in a few decades, increased the productive forces 100-fold, working towards our revolution. But the anarchy that Marx imputes to the capitalist regime lies in the fact that the capitalist accumulates by companies, by enterprises which operate and live in a market environment. This system, and we shall see more of this challenging but central techno-economic thesis in a few examples that follow, this system only strives to organize itself in pursuit of the maximum profit of the firm, which is frequently achieved by subtracting profits from other firms. At the outset, and here the classical economics of the bourgeois school were right, the superiority of the large, organized firm over the super-anarchy of the small production led to so much greater profitability that in addition to the profit of the individual capitalist and an excellent provision for new plants and new progress, the worker in advanced industry placed dishes unknown to the small artisan onto his table. But by running each company as an entity closed in on itself with its own accounting of payments and receipts on the market with the aim of generating maximum profit, in the course of development, the problems relating to the general performance of human labor are addressed badly, and things can even go backwards. The capitalist system avoids posing the question of maximizing not profit, but output for the same amount of effort and labor time, so that having taken the shares of social accumulation, consumption can be enhanced, and labor effort, and labor obligation reduced. Concerned only with realizing the marketability of the company's product at high price and paying as little as possible for the products of the other companies, the capitalist system cannot come towards the general alignment of production to consumption, and plunges into successive crises. Thus, the socialist demand aims to tear down not only the legal right and economy of private property, but at the same time the market economy and the enterprise economy. Only when we go in the direction that leads to overcoming all three of these forms of the present economy, private ownership of the products, the money-based market, and the organization of production by firms, can we be said to be moving towards socialist organization. In what follows, we will see how by suppressing any one of these, the socialist objective is lost. The criterion of individual and personal private economy can be largely overcome even in the midst of capitalism. We fight capitalism as a class and not just capitalists as individuals. There is capitalism whenever products are taken to market or otherwise accounted for on the asset side of the business, understood as a distinct economic island, albeit a very large one, whereas wages are on the liability side of the balance sheet. Bourgeois economics is double-entry economics. The bourgeois individual is not a man, he is a firm. We want to destroy every firm. We want to suppress the double-entry economy and establish the simple-entry economy, which history already knows from the time when the troglodyte went out to pick as many coconuts as he had companions in the cave and went out bearing only his hands. We already knew all of this in 1848, which does not prevent us from continuing to say it with youthful ardor. We shall see that many things have happened for 100 years in the interplay of the relations under consideration, all of which have made us even tougher in upholding the same thesis. After warning the reader that even the general pronoun becomes, in the socialist system, a social pronoun. This is end of section 3, end of part 2.